Okay, so I want to transition to the series that we've been talking about, The Way. And what I want to do is I want to quickly summarize it. We have one more week left next week, but I got to catch everybody up to where we are. So 0 to 60 here, okay? All right, so we started with this statistic, disturbing, concerning statistic. When Americans are polled and asked whether or not they would self-identify as Christians, 72 to 78% of Americans say, yes, I consider myself that. However, when you peel back the surface a little bit and you ask them, does that include following Jesus every day and every moment and looking to him for decisions and guidance and direction, and you kind of give your life to his leadership? Only 8 to 12% of the people would say they're followers of his. Now, that's a little perplexing. It's a little ironic, actually, when you think that when Jesus infiltrated this world, he did not invite people to become Christians. You know what he invited them to become? Followers of his. Peter, come follow me. Matthew, come follow me. And he had a distinct idea in his mind what that meant, and he hasn't changed his mind. It's still what he invites us to. He invites us to be followers, students, apprentices, or his term would have been Talmudim. Come be my follower. And this is what he was thinking with it. These three things, we put them up every week. That would mean that we would be increasingly with Jesus throughout our day, just in everyday circumstances, everyday moments of life. And as we do that over many years, our thinking would increasingly become like his thinking. It's just what happens. And then as we increasingly think like Jesus over many years, we actually would do the things that he did, not because we're trying to mimic him, but because our thinking has so shifted that we actually could be increasingly mistaken for him. This is what it means to be a follower. And it might not be surprising then that there would be a whole bunch of us who would rather identify with being a Christian, i.e. I got my ticket punched for heaven, versus saying, no, every day I'm simply a student, an apprentice, a learner of Jesus the Messiah. We live in a world where there are all kinds of pressures on our lives to not make that happen. Change can be extraordinarily difficult for us. When we think of who Jesus was and who we are, we go, well, that's an impossible leap, can't do that. So we put this graphic up to kind of get ourselves all on the same page, that there are environments that every one of us are in. We wake up and we're formed just by being alive. To be human is to be formed by our environments. And here are some of the factors around those, like ideas, images, and stories, habits we're involved in, people and experiences. These all form us. But thank goodness that Jesus comes along and says, when you decide to be my follower and give your life to me and receive the forgiveness I bought for you on a cross and my resurrection that gives you life, I will come and live inside of you by my spirit, the same spirit that raised me from death to life. I will come. I know that's challenging to think of, but this is what actually happens. And he says, I will now put my spirit inside of you, and those things that help form you are going to be, well, there's going to be mitigating circumstances that you can find yourself in because of God's Spirit. Paul mentioned this a number of times. One place he's so clear is in Romans chapter 12. This is what he says: don't copy the behavior and customs, the environments of the world, but let God transform you into a new person. How? Well, by changing the way you think. Then you will learn to know God's will for you, which is good, pleasing, and perfect. So we've been looking at three areas that are ways that the Holy Spirit can use in our lives that mitigate, push against those malforming kinds of things that happen just by living in this world. So for example, images, ideas, and stories that some of them are good, some of them are hurtful. Those that are false and not true, God would say, well, gain some knowledge, engage yourself intentionally in discovering who Jesus is, study who it is, read, find out who Jesus is. And through the course of that, just like we sang, he is the way, he is the truth, and the life, you're going to start to see new stories and new images under the power of God's Spirit. When it comes to habits, those things that we just do, that are just part of us, some of them are good, some of them are corrosive and erosive in our souls. He would say, well, there are specific practices that you can engage in: solitude and Sabbath and fasting and those kinds of new practices that offset the effects of bad habits. And then thirdly, he would say there are people and experiences that have profoundly shaped us and have shaped us and will shape us every day. And there are experiences with people that you can intentionally surround yourself with that are going to help heal and mitigate the pain and the erosive nature of some experiences and people that have formed us badly. This is the hope that we have as followers of Jesus Christ, that by his Spirit we are not left in the environments that we are in by ourselves. He wants to form us into people who increasingly think like himself and are mistaken for him. So let's start with where we're at today, and that has to do with experiences with people, community. You might think of it that way. So just to comment about how people and experiences in our daily environments form us, unintentionally, just by living with them. And let me state the obvious. I hear this virtually every week from somebody, that the environment of their family that they grew up in is their most significant and lasting forming environment that they've had. How they were raised, where they were raised, the culture of love or the culture of disappointment or the culture of failure or fear or worry, whatever the culture of their home, the environment of their home has done more to form them than anyone else or any other circumstance or environment. And that just stands to reason, doesn't it? We spend the most formative days of our lives when we're young in the most formative environment. Sure, there are other potent environments, friends and classmates, professors, bosses, coaches, brothers in arms, and so on. But none have the potency and the lasting effect of the environments that we grew up in. Nobody forms who we think of ourselves to be more so than the homes we were raised in. Now, for some of us, those environments were rich and filled with joy and intimacy and love, and they have been the most wonderful formative environment. They really have. Others have had families that were really maybe more disconnected individuals who certainly loved each other, but sure and steadily just moved toward independence from one another rather than interdependence. And of course, there are others that were raised in broken and angry and fractured and fearful homes. And some of us who have been raised in those have tried to reestablish those and try to build something different. And we haven't had as much success as what we would like to have. And some of us have been rejected or even abandoned by our families as we tried to put those together. You see, there's all kinds. But every one of them is formative to us. So whatever your family of origin is, it has formed you to be who you are today more than any other environment. We probably would all agree with that. From the first chapter of Genesis forward, we can see that when God thought about individual people being born and birthed and created in this world, he seems to always think of them in the context of not as individuals by themselves, but as individuals in the context of community. Whether it's a marriage or a family or other extended ways, it just seems to be how God seems to think. You don't even get out of the first chapter of Genesis before that vision for humanity, that we would do life together, is what he envisions. The truth is that people we spend time with are those that have the greatest impact on us, and it's by God's design. It's what he thought would happen. There's a short verse in the writings of Paul in the New Testament that reflect this. You hear Paul's mentioned a lot around here. And in case you didn't know, he's this really influential first century church planter, follower of Jesus, who has an amazing transformation experience himself with Jesus. And some years following that, he travels around the Mediterranean. He starts new churches, new mission outposts for Jesus. And one of those is in the city of Corinth. And at some point along the way, here's what's going on when he writes this. And when I read it to you, you'll be familiar. You just maybe didn't even think it was in the Bible. But what's happening is the church in Corinth that he's established is kind of infiltrated by people who have a divergent message from the message of Jesus that Paul gave, and actually wants this group of people to go a step back and follow a set of rules and laws that are there. And they're actually having some success doing that with this young church family. And Paul is really concerned because, again, who we hang out with greatly shapes who we are. And there's some shaping factor that's entered into a church, and Paul's concerned with it. And so he writes them in his letter. He writes this, which, by the way, you wouldn't have known this either. It's actually a quote that Paul quotes. And interesting, this guy is so culturally savvy. You know who he quotes? He quotes the Kevin Hart of his day. He quotes a comedian. That's who he quotes, a guy by the name Menander, who traveled around, and he was this rock star comedian and actor in that time of the Roman. I said, you didn't know that, did you? I didn't know that. I found that out. But here's Paul's quote, inspired quote from Paul. 1 Corinthians 15:33 says, don't be fooled by those who say such things, what these others were saying, for bad company corrupts good character. Did your parents ever use that on you? Mine did. If they didn't, they should have. Yeah. The bottom line is, Paul is saying, as Menander did, like who you hang out with has a formative effect. In middle school, it was Rick Stenson for me. Rick was a bad actor on campus. Middle school, 7th grade, new to the town that I was in, first week or two of school, and I get connected with Rick Stenson. And I'm drawn to him for some reason. I don't know why. Maybe it was because I felt like compassion and sadness for him because he didn't really have a dad that was present, and his mom was like struggling to make ends meet, and his family was just in chaos. I don't know. Maybe that was it. I don't know. But I remember a teacher coming to me one day and saying, hey, I got to tell you something. You don't want to hang out with Rick Stenson. And the reason you don't want to is you're going to build a reputation just by hanging out with him, and then the chances are you're going to become like him, and you don't want that. Well, that really scared me that I would be like Rick Stenson. It scared me even more that I have to tell him. And so I never did. And then a couple of weeks later, he got himself in some trouble of some kind or another, and he just left. And I never saw Rick ever again in my life. But the principle is this, that who we hang out with really does shape us. So while it's true that bad company corrupts good character, when you look at the environments that Jesus was in, however, and the people that he chose to hang out with, it seems as much as Jesus knew that was a reality, you know what else Jesus believed? That good company can overcome bad character. Or maybe said another way, good company can reinforce good character. The last several weeks, you've heard me say over and over again that if you're going to have Jesus form his life in us so that we increasingly think like him, part of the practices of that are going to have to be alone solitude with Jesus in a place where you're not distracted, where you and he can have quality conversation, in a place where you and he can hear and talk to one another. I just don't see any other way that is part of our journey with him. It doesn't have to be ours, but it has to be regular. I just see no other way to do it. I would say that I see no other way of being formed in Christ other than we would have his formation take place in a community of people. So yes, alone and in solitude and silence for sure, but equally important is a group of people that we might pick that would form us increasingly in the nature and character of Jesus Christ, who will help us, will encourage us, will challenge us on occasion, but more than anything, encourage us along the way. I just don't see how we can move from being a Christian to being a follower in a Lone Ranger kind of setting. I don't think that's Jesus' plan. And if you look at his way, you would see that the Jesus way of community is absolutely essential. It's not optional. It is just part. If we're serious about changing into the likeness of Christ, we're going to do it together. We're designed to do life in families, right from Genesis on, or with friends at the very least, or at least one other person, probably beneficial, a small group of people, 2, 3, 5, 6, 12. I don't know what that number is. But people who share physical proximity and share concerns and consequences together and common responsibilities. When that happens, Jesus leverages those experiences with those people, call them communities if you will, to form us into people who increasingly think like him. I came across this quote from Richard Plass. He's recently written a book called The Relational Soul. He's a theologian and follower of Jesus, and this is what he writes. He writes, at the core of our being in this is this truth. We are designed for and defined by our relationships. We were born with a relentless longing to participate in the lives of others. We cannot be relational. We cannot not be relational. We cannot exist well without connection and communion with another. If you were a social scientist in Jesus' day and you wanted to be an observer of his life and what he did and how he did community and how he pulled people together and how he intentionally hung out with people, you would actually get some information about what his thinking would be when it came to establishing these communities. And I would say there are two things that we could see from his life just by observing how he did things. One would be these Jesus communities were intentional decisions on his part. They were intentional things. They didn't just happen. He thought it through. He prayed it through. He considered, who am I going to surround myself with? Do you believe that it would actually be formative for him? And he would be formative for them. Look at what we read in the experiences that Matthew tells us about. In Matthew 4, we read this. One day, as Jesus was walking along the shore of the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon, also called Peter, and Andrew, throwing a net into the water, for they fished for a living. Jesus called out to them, "Come, follow me." There you have it again. "And I will show you how to fish for people." They left their nets at once and followed him. A little further up the shore, he saw two other brothers, James and John, sitting in a boat with their father Zebedee, repairing their nets, and he called to them to come too. They immediately followed him, leaving the boat with their father behind. How many followers did Jesus pick? One? No, there's at least four. But you look at these four guys that he picks, they're like boys from the hood for him. They're all from northern Galilee, good Jewish boys, and he picks people that are like himself, right? Just what we're inclined to do. When we hang out with people, we look, first of all, not for what their influence in our life would be. We look for, am I enjoying your company? We look for sameness. And some reason, some way, Jesus does that too, but there are others as well. In Matthew 9, just a little further, he says, as Jesus was walking along once again, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at a tax collector's booth. "Follow me," there it is, "and be my disciple," Jesus said to him. So Matthew got up and followed him. Later, Matthew invited Jesus and his disciples over to his home as a dinner guest, along with many tax collectors. This was Matthew's community, and other disreputable sinners. Matthew's hanging out with people that are like him. Jesus, on the other hand, does that too, plus people who are not like him. And when the Pharisees saw this, they asked his disciples, "Why in all the world does your teacher eat with such scum?" Interesting. I love the way Jesus does this. He hangs with people that are like-minded, and then he reaches out to people who are so different from himself, and he wants to be with them. And I don't think it's just to impact them, though that is the case. I think he wants to be with them so that there's a mutual shaping that goes on, a forming that happens. And you actually can't be formed well if everybody who's around you says yes to everything that you do. It doesn't form you. It reinforces the bad forming. And Jesus won't have that. See, Matthew in this story is a tax collector. He's a traitor. He's the guy that's collecting revenue from his own citizens to give to the despised, oppressive Roman Caesar, and he's making a pretty good dollar doing it. And Jesus reaches out to him and says, "I want you to be in my group. I want you to be in my community." Interesting, isn't it? At one point, we're told that Jesus has this group of people that are in his community, and he's going to try to narrow this down a little bit. And look at the intentionality with which he figures this out, how he thinks, right? This is what we read in Luke 6. One day, soon afterward, Jesus went up on a mountain to pray, and he prayed to God all night. Presumably, because we see what happens next, at daybreak, he called together all of his disciples and chose 12 of them to be his apostles. What's he doing in that conversation with God? With his Father, he's sitting there, I think, and he's going through a list of people, maybe hundreds that are part of this big discipleship following community. And he says, "Father, I want to pick the right ones. I want to pick the ones that I can help form. But they're also going to form me because I'm human as well. So who should we have as part of this group?" It's a big deal. It's not just going to happen. It's not going to be as we walk along only. It's going to be as intentionally. You help me form a group of people who I can, with my good company, I can overcome their bad character, and they can reinforce the good character that's already in me. It says that he picked Simon, whose name is Peter, Andrew, Peter's brother, James, John, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James, son of Alphaeus, Simon, who was called the Zealot, Judas, son of James, and another Judas, Judas Iscariot, who was later betrayed. It's so interesting when you read this. Apart from a few names where he adds like a family relationship to it, there's only two in there that he actually adds a descriptor of who they were. Did you pick up the two names? One is Simon the Zealot. You know what a zealot was? He was part of like a clandestine underground revolutionary gang that despised the Roman occupation. They were in some places referred to as men of the dagger because they would carry a dagger under the sleeve of their cloak. And if they would find a Roman officer or a Roman soldier, they knew exactly what to do with that dagger, and they would do that and then slide off into the dark of the night. They were terrorists to the Romans, is what they were. They were radical Jews, believing that the Jewish way and the law was the only way. And this is who he was. In that same circle that Jesus picks is Matthew. He's stealing from his own people. Can you imagine those staff meetings? You got this zealot and you've got Matthew at opposite ends of the political ideological scale. And Jesus picks them to be in the same small group. Whoa, did they have lively conversations, I guess. But Jesus is up to something here. What an incredible mix of people. I believe that what Jesus was doing was intentionally forming unlikely people into a community of 12 ragtag guys so different from each other. But it would be those people that would be the formation agents in the earliest days of the church. And you and I are here because of how Jesus picked them and formed them, and they formed one another. Don't you ever wonder if it might have been a lot easier or better if Jesus had just done the whole thing, like the Save the World campaign on his own? Yeah, probably. But he was about something else. He's about helping people form into the likeness of himself so that when he's gone, by the power of his Spirit, he would take those people and they would reshape the whole world as a result of that. If you were to summarize the way of Jesus and how to reform the influence that people in your past and experiences with those people have had, I want to say, I think Jesus intentionally would say, pick some people who can offset the erosive family, friends, environments you've been before. Because that new set of carefully chosen, Jesus-following people, you'll have an influence on, but they will influence you. And it's a way of being formed through those. The second thing that I would say you see in Jesus is that these are imperfect communities. They're intentional, but they're also imperfect. There are many examples of how Jesus' experiment with community seems really imperfect, and it seems to go wrong and seems to be a failure. It doesn't take very long to read Matthew, going back to his account in Matthew 20, he tells us this story. It says, when the mother of James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came to Jesus with her sons, she knelt respectfully to ask a favor. What is your request? He asked. She replied, in your kingdom, please let my two sons sit in places of honor next to you, one on your right and one on your left. In other words, my boys and I have been talking. And we know that one day you're going to have reign here in Israel, and we just want to make sure that we have the premier spots in your administration. Could you take care of that for us, Jesus? But Jesus answered by saying to them, you don't know what you're asking. Not that you're foolish, not that it's a terrible thing you've just asked, you just don't understand. Are you able to drink from the bitter cup of suffering I'm about to drink? Which I don't know if they understood. They just said, yes, for sure, count us in, we're able. Jesus told them, you will indeed drink from my bitter cup, but I have no right to say who will sit on my right or my left. My Father has prepared those places for the ones that he has chosen. Get this, word got out. When the 10 other disciples heard what James and John had asked, they were indignant. What was that conversation like? What did they say to James and John? They go, dudes, what are you doing? We're a team. We're like, how could you be so selfish? That's a logical thing to think happens. Can you feel the tension in this group? This community that Jesus has handpicked it's not perfect. There's tension in it, and there's misunderstanding, and there's a lot of work to actually form a cohesive team of people that are there for each other. I just wonder sometimes whether Jesus questioned whether he was even on the right track with the people that he had picked, but he perseveres. Because you see, and when it unfolds to the end, it becomes clear that Jesus was in fact right. That bad company corrupts good character, but equally and more powerfully in a way. Good company can overcome bad character. So Jesus says this in verse 25, but Jesus called them together and he said, we're going to do this differently. You know that the rulers of this world lord it over their people, and officials flaunt their authority over them, over those under them. But among you, it's going to be different. Whoever wants to be a leader among you is going to be your servant. And Jesus puts together this small community of people. And they are the agents that reform the culture in the world by the power of God's Spirit. Offsetting the unintentional formation of family and friend environments that is just part of some of our lives has left some significant scars and deep wounds. And it turns out that not surrounding ourselves with people who enable us or necessarily just say yes to what we've experienced or reinforcing what we've experienced and the anger that we feel for that, as hard as it is for us, turns out that it's actually best for us. It helps form us and do things differently, as Jesus speaks about doing differently. You see, where formation happens is in this messy middle between the intentional group that we idealistically kind of put together, community we put together, and just the realism of the imperfection. It's in that middle place that formation happens for us. It's messy, but it's profoundly, profoundly powerful. It's in this tension that Jesus does some of his best formation work by his Spirit in us. And if we didn't step into it intentionally, we would avoid the whole thing. Or when we see how imperfect it is, we would give up on it all and we would just divorce that setting and we would go on and find someplace else. And Jesus doesn't do that. He sets a model for us, and it's a spectacular model for us. Now, these are not perfect communities because the members are not perfect. In the middle of the last century, 1950s and 60s, a man by the name of Jean Vanier was living in France, and he observed something in his community in France where people with physical disabilities or developmental disabilities, rather than being cared for in just a kind and gracious way, they were institutionalized where they were kind of, he thought, warehoused and not really cared for. They were given medical treatment, but just not cared for. And so he developed this idea. He said, well, what if we build communities of people with the developmental challenges and disabilities, but we match them up with people who are whole-bodied and well, and we actually put them in a community and they live together. They aren't just there to give medical care, they're actually living together, sharing life together in that community. He ended up calling it the L'Arche communities, and they spread to 37 countries around the world. It was an amazing way, a new way of thinking, of integrating the unlikelies together to help form one another. He said, I don't see these people with the physical developmental disabilities as objects to be cared for. I see them as teachers to the able-bodied. And he just had this different view. He writes this in one of his books. Almost everyone finds their early days in these kinds of communities as ideal. It all seems perfect. They feel they're surrounded by saints and heroes, or at least the most exceptional people who are everything they want to be themselves. And then comes the letdown. The greater their idealization of the community at the start, the greater their disenchantment. If people manage to get through this second period, they come to the third phase, that of realism and true commitment. They no longer see other members of the community as saints or devils, but as people. Each with a mixture of good and bad, darkness and light, each growing and each with their own hope. The community is neither heaven nor hell, but planted firmly on earth, and they're ready to walk in it and with it. They accept the community and the other members as they are. They are confident that together they can grow towards something more beautiful. Application. What's this mean for us? Well, let me finish with this. A few weeks ago, you might recall we interviewed a couple of guys on our stage here. If you haven't, you can go to our website and you can download a profound and amazing interview with these two guys, both who had come to the end of their rope and essentially the end of their life. They're both addicted to stuff, and there's critical and crisis experiences that they have going on in their world and their life, and kind of in a point of desperation, God invades their world and turns their life around, and they find the renewing, regenerating power of Jesus Christ and his Spirit in their lives. Well, one of the guys, Brendan, began a recovery center in Prescott following that. And he told us a little bit about that. So in the last couple of weeks, several of us went up to Prescott to be with them and to see what they do and how they do it, because we know that there are needs within our own community and within our own church family that finding a possibility of recovery and release from addiction would be really important. And so we want to pursue that. We went up on a Wednesday night. Now here's the interesting thing. On Wednesday night, we gathered in somebody's home, backyard and house, wherever we could meet. There were 42 or 44 of us, something like that. The next night, on Thursday night, that group, along with some others, including 250 other men and women, got together, like all addicts in this room, trying to help each other and figure it out. Now, where does all that start? Starts with one guy saying, I have an addiction issue in my world and I can't do this myself. He had turned his life over to his higher power, Jesus Christ. And now he's got this in his life where he realizes, I can't do this on my own. It can't just be Jesus and me. I mean, that's enough for salvation, but I need some others with me. And so he thinks of a group of guys that he can invite together who are similar to that and different from all kinds of backgrounds. And 6 guys show up the first night. He doesn't know what to do. But he says, if this is going to be about Jesus, I guess we'll look at the Bible, because the Bible, I think, is about him. So he opens up the Bible to something that Jesus says, and they just talk about it together as a group. And after talking about it for a little while, he just goes around the circle. He says, maybe we should talk to Jesus about our stuff. So what's your high and low for the week? And that's the first night. That's a year and a half ago. Now 250 people on a Thursday night get together. Because one person said, I am going to intentionally surround myself with some people who maybe not like me, but we have something similar. We want to grow and be reformed in this world. We think Jesus is part of it. Would you want to be part of something like that? And then look what the King of the universe does, because he longs for us to be reformed into his likeness so that we'll increasingly think like him and be mistaken for him. And he sometimes does it, oftentimes does it with one person who intentionally finds some others, imperfect as they are. I sat around that group that night with 15 of us around a fire pit, that Bible study where there was 40 or 42 of us, 42 or 44 of us. It is, for me, from my personal experience in life, one of the most transparent, truthful, honest, disclosing group of people I've ever sat in a circle with before. There are guys that have lost $1 million homes and huge businesses and have given up their professions because of their addiction. There are people who have lived under bridges in that group. There are people who are white collar and blue collar. They could not be more diverse from one another. They couldn't. One of the guys in the group says, a young man, this is his first night there. And he said, this is the first night. I just joined into the recovery center. And I'm coming from a 12-day bender in Phoenix. And my truck and all my earthly belongings are in that truck someplace in Phoenix. I have no idea where it is because I can't remember the last 12 days. They're just gone for me. What I do know is 12 days ago, I left a rehab program for this 36th time. And that night, I did the same thing over again. But I'm here in this circle tonight because I think maybe Jesus might have some. I've never been to a Jesus-centered rehab recovery program. I'm just thinking maybe it would be, and I'm wondering if you guys, would you pray that I would be clean tomorrow morning? Would you do that? One guy gathers some others around him and says, let's do something with Jesus. It's incredible when you intentionally recognize your own weakness and you look to surround yourself with people who you can do life together. That's community. That's community. I think we've got some people who are involved in marriages that aren't really very good with each other. Do you know that the average couple waits 7 years from the time first problem shows up on the horizon till they go ask for help? And by that time, so much pain and hurt has happened, it's so hard to undo it. Some of us who are in that place as couples need to go, I need to find a couple who's further down the road than me on this. And I need to humble myself and go to them and go, I think you might be able to help me. I think you just might be able to help me. Would you meet with me and my wife and maybe we could talk together around what Jesus would have, because we're jacking this thing up. I think there are some older gentlemen, old like me. That's the only amen we got this morning. Thanks, Kevin. There's some older guys like me that need to go to a generation younger than us and go, I don't have much to offer maybe. But if you'd grab a coffee with me sometime, maybe we could learn from each other. See, I talk to guys my age, and that idea, because I've asked like half a dozen of them in the last 10 days whether they would do it. You know what their answer to that is? I would have nothing to offer. Now, that is not the voice of Jesus in you. It's not. That prompted me to ask some young guys that are a generation younger than me, would you ever be open to asking somebody older than you to walk through life with you? They go, I'd be way too scared to do that, because I think they would say no. Really? So you got a younger generation who would actually be willing to engage in this conversation. You got older guys who would be willing, but they don't think they have anything to offer. And the younger guys are thinking, no, I'm too afraid. How does this start? One person goes to another person and goes, would you have coffee with me? And let's just do a little life together and see what happens out of that. You don't have to plan it. It's imperfect, but it starts with intentionality. And I could give you so many other examples where this could happen, but somebody makes the first move. So who's around you that you think can do it on their own, but maybe they can't do it without you? What's the need in your own life that you need to be bold and humble and go to somebody else you think might be just a step ahead of you and go, could you walk with me in this? Intentionality. Don't expect perfection. We're all broken, right? But what if we did that? What would Jesus do? Might he change our worlds in the way that he did it through a ragtag group of 12 guys? Maybe he would. Might he do that for his sake? Now, Jesus, we want to think about how this could happen with you and for you and by you. In many ways, we're just afraid. In many ways, we're self-focused and think about just our own deal, and nobody else would be interested. And that's just not your kingdom. It's not how you built it. It's not your plan for it. So Jesus, would you give us the courage to do a little bit of self-reflection and think about the areas, the place in our lives where we just need help. We just need help. And might we have the courage to admit that? Take a risk of asking somebody who is ahead of us that you might just have orchestrated. You might just have your fingers in it. And it could be the key that all the erosive formation that's happened could be turned by the power of your Spirit into something that would be beautiful in the life we've dreamed of. And we have the courage to take the risk and offer ourselves to others. And if they say no, well, no big deal. But may we have the courage, Jesus, that you just might be in it and trust you to that end. And we'll thank you for it. Do great things in our church family, Jesus, for your fame. Amen.